Hey friends, what up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf 13. Daf Yud Gimel. Daf Love. Daf Ahava. Ahava is of course Gematria Yud Gimel. Echad is Gematria Yud Gimel. What else is Gematria Yud Gimel? Alright. Friends, what does Daf Yud Gimel talk about? Daf Yud Gimel talks about mostly how we know that when it comes to like grain and stuff, that its Meiser is its year of Meiser is determined based on the year in which it reached 1/3 of its growth. So once it hits a third, you take a look at the year in which it hits a third. That's the year that you're gonna have to separate Trumas and Meiser from, right? Because we learned about the different Rosh Hashanahs for Meiser and things like that. So what we're saying is that the year in which at the point at which it reaches a third of its growth, that is the point that we look at to say, okay, which year do we consider it for Meiser? And we had said that the Rosh Hashanah, when it comes to Meiser, is Rosh Chodesh Tishrei, is the first of Tishrei. So therefore we say, look, at what point did this grain reach a third of its growth? And based on if it's before or after Tishrei, so then that will determine what year you have to separate Trumas and Meisers, because of course we don't separate Trumas and Meisers from the sort of yield of one year to separate it for the yield of another year. It has to be within the year in which it is supposed to be, in which it grew essentially. Okay, well, that sounds like a lot of fun. Let's jump in. Fine. So we're about 8 or 9 lines before, well, let's say about 10 lines before the bottom of the page on Daf Yud Beis and Yud Beis. Tanan also we learn over there, where? In Meisris. Hatilso mishatitzmach, fenugreek. Once it sprouts, so then that is when it's considered ready for Meiser. Okay, so at the point in which it sprouts, so what year are we in? 5782 now or something? So if it sprouted before Rosh Hashanah, before the paper boy, there he is, dropping off the paper. Let's go, hurry up already. There he is, speeding off into the night. So then, what are we talking about? Right. So if you have fenugreek, and the fenugreek sprouted before, let's say in our example, before Rosh Hashanah, like a month ago or whatever it is, so then it would be considered, the Meiser would be from last year's crop, and you would have to separate Meiser with other fenugreek from last year. And if it sprouted after Rosh Hashanah, so then it would be part of this year's crop, and you would tithe it with other fenugreek that sprouted in this year. Alright. When it comes to grain and olives, and Rashi points out that actually grapes can be considered grain as well. As it says, what does it say? Ketvuas gornuchus tvuas yekeb. Like the grain of your granary, which is grains, but also like the grain of your vineyard. So we see that grapes can also be referred to grain. So it says, right, hatvua v'azesim, when it comes to grain, which is, I guess, the different kinds of grains, but also grapes, v'azesim, as well as olives, mishavi u'shlish, once they reach a third of their growth at that, right, that is when we look at, okay, well, what year is it? And then we consider it for Trumas and Meisers in the year in which it reaches 1/3 of its growth. What does it mean by fenugreek when it sprouts? When the seeds sprout. Alright, honestly, don't tell anybody, but I still don't really know what that means. Alright, but whatever, when it sprouts. Whatever, when I grow fenugreek, I'll figure it out. What do you want me to tell you? Okay, skip the next few words. Minani mili. How do we know that? Well, I guess you can read it. Right, so we say that when it comes to grain and when it comes to olives, so once they reach a third of their growth, that is, what establishes them for their, in terms of their year for Meiser, in terms of which year do we consider it having grown in? At what point is it chayev in Meiser? From the time that it reaches a third minani mili. How do we know this? Friends, you ready? Good. Amr Rav Asi, Amr Rabbi Yochanan. Says Rav Asi in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Umatuba Mishmei Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Wow, I guess some say that maybe it was Taka even Rabbi Yossi Aglili. It's a pretty big deal. Rabbi Yossi Aglili, the Tana, the contemporary of Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yishmael. Big deal. Amar Kra, the pasuk says, Miketz Sheva Shonim. All right, the pasuk. Who could tell me where this pasuk is? What it's a reference to? It's a reference to Hakel. That the pasuk says Miketz Sheva Shonim, that after 7 years, b'moed shnas hashmita, at the end of the Shemitah year, b'chag Sukkos, at Sukkos time. So Sukkos now of the 8th year, and it says that everyone's going to gather in Jerusalem, and the king will read from the Sefer Torah. So, Shnas Hashmita ma'avidte. What does Shemitah have to do with anything? Right? The pasuk says. Let's read it again. Miketz Sheva Shonim. So at the end of 7 years, okay. B'moed Shnas Hashmita. What does Shemitah have to do with anything? B'chag Sukkos on Sukkos. Meaning, the pasuk could just say Miketz Sheva Shonim after 7 years. B'chag Sukkos. When comes now the festival of Sukkos after 7 years. What does Shemitah have to do with anything? It's not Shemitah anymore. It's now the 8th year. It's Sukkos at the beginning of the 8th year. Why are we mentioning Shemitah? It adds absolutely nothing to the simple explanation of the pasuk, apparently. So, where am I? Shnas Hashmita ma'avid te b'chag Sukkos shminasi. Sukkos is already the 8th year. So why are we mentioning anything about Shemitah? Shemitah's past. Ella, lo malach to say to you, kol tvua shevia shlish b'shvius lifnei Rosh Hashanah, that any grain that has reached a third on Shemitah before Rosh Hashanah, atanoig bo minig shvius bashminis, so you treat it like Shemitah on the 8th year. Meaning, the pasuk had mentioned Shemitah in the context of Hakel. We're saying and we're pointing out that Shemitah really doesn't belong there. What does it add? It's no longer Shemitah anyways. But the point is that, what we're learning from there is that if you have a grain that grows on Shemitah, and it reaches a third of its growth during Shemitah, so then even in the 8th year, even when it comes to the 8th year, it's still going to be considered Shemitah. This grain is still going to have the Kedusha Shvius, because the holiness of Shvius, because it reached a third of its growth in the previous year. So that's how we see this idea from the extra word of B'moed Shnas HaShemitah. That's how we learn out that what's it doing there? What it's there is to teach us that you can even have a situation where there are things that grow during Shemitah that retain their holiness during the 8th year, and that is if they've reached a third of their growth. So we see that grain that has reached a third of its growth is so the year in which the grain reaches a third of its growth is going to be the year in which it's going to be chayev in Meiser, and in this case also it's going to have Kedushas Shvius. Amalei Reb Zera Reb Asi, now says Reb Zera to Reb Asi, V'doma lo ayil klal v'kom rachmanu tishamet v'teza al chag HaSukkos. Now Reb Zera asks Reb Asi, says, wait a second. How do we know that that's how to understand the pasuk? How do we know that what the pasuk is saying is that if you have grain that reached a third of its growth during Shemitah year, it's going to continue to have Kedusha Shvius into the 8th year? Maybe it's saying something else, which is simply that Shemitah continues until Sukkot of the 8th year. That Shemitah doesn't end at Rosh Hashanah following Shemitah. Shemitah then continues into the 8th year until Sukkot. Maybe that's what it means. That's what the point of Shvius in that pasuk is. Lo salkadaitech, to which Reb Asi says, no way, no how. Dichsiv, because the pasuk says, V'chago osif b'tzeis hashana. Because we have another pasuk. What does this pasuk say? Well, let's read it. Well, let's read half of it. The pasuk says, V'chago osif b'tzeis hashana, that the festival of gathering at the end of the year, well, I guess when the previous year goes out, ba'aspecha is ma'asechem and asada, when you gather your handiwork from the field. Now, so as we just read, the pasuk mentions this asif, this gathering twice. It says v'chaga asif, v'tzeis hashana be'aspecha es ma'asechem and asada. So it mentions gathering twice in the pasuk. So why does it have to mention gathering twice? Mention gathering once. If the point is to teach us that there's a festival that comes at the time that you're gathering things, givaldik. So we got it from one of the places where I mentioned it in the pasuk. How come we're mentioning asif twice in the pasuk? Okay, so one of them is teaching that the festival comes out when you gather. What are we learning from the other? Asif. So, again, the pasuk says that the festival of gathering at the end of the previous year, my Asif, what is this gathering? If we're going to say, oh, it means that it's talking about the festival that comes at the time of gathering, that Sukkot comes at the time that you're gathering your grain up from the field that's been laying out in the field drying all summer, and now you're going to gather it up. But if you continue reading in the pasuk, it says, when you gather your handiwork from the field. So then what is the first so what does Chag Asif teach us? Elamai Asif Kotzir. So you know what Asif means? You know what gathering means over here? Gathering means that you're actually harvesting. Meaning, from the second be'aspicha, right? When it says be'aspicha in the pasuk, like the shorish of asif, the second time in that pasuk. So that's how we learn out that it's the festival that comes when you gather things. So what do we learn out from asif? It's a drasha to teach us that even if there are things that you can end up harvesting at that time, if there's grain that that's ready to be harvested at Sukkot time. So it says v'chaga asif b'tzeis Hashanah. The drasha is that Chaga Asif, which we're understanding to actually be referring to harvesting, that if there's grain that's ready to be harvested at Sukkot time, B'tzeis Hashanah, we nonetheless treat it as though it's from the previous year. And we're going to see in a second that the rabbis assume that anything that is ready to be harvested at Sukkot time has already reached a third before Rosh Hashanah in the previous year. So what do we see? So we see that again, when it says B'chaga Asif, so it says B'chaga Asif B'tzeis Hashanah, and we're understanding it to be harvesting, and we're saying that anything that you're going to be harvesting, if you have grain that's ready to be harvested on Sukkot, so you end up harvesting it on Sukkot, and we're saying that it's B'tzeis Hashanah, we treat it as though it's from the previous year. We treat it as though it's from the previous year. And the rabbis understand that any grain that you're going to be harvesting on Sukkot already reached a third in the previous year. So what do we see? So we see that grain that reached a third of its growth is going to be governed for Maasros based on the year in which it reached a third. And therefore, when it comes to harvesting grain on Sukkot, if there's grain that's ready to be harvested on Sukkot, so two things. A, we know that it already reached a third of its growth in the previous year. And B, it's B'tzeis Hashanah, we're going to treat it as though it's from the previous year. So we see that any grain that reached a third of its growth, or once grain reaches a third of its growth, it's governed for Maasros based on the year in which it reached a third of its growth. So we see from this pasuk that we determine Trumas and Maasros based on the year in which the grain reaches 1/3 of its growth. So, my Asif, says the Gemara, what is this Asif mentioned in the pasuk Kotzir? It's referring to harvesting, that if there's grain that's ready to be harvested on Sukkot, V'kimlu l'Rabbanan d'chotvo sheniktzur b'chag b'yadu shavi shlish lifnei Rosh Hashanah, and the rabbis determine that any grain that is harvested or ready to be harvested on Sukkot, b'yadua, it is certain shavi shlish lifnei Rosh Hashanah, that it had already reached the 1/3 threshold before Rosh Hashanah, v'kakari le b'tzeis Hashanah, and we are calling it b'tzeis Hashanah, i.e. it's governed from the previous year. So we see that the year in which grain reaches 1/3 of its growth is the year in which it is treated for Meiser. Friends, you got that? Good, let's go weiter. Amale Rabbi Yirmiyah le Reb Zera, now says Rabbi Yirmiyah to Reb Zera, v'kimlu l'Rabbanan ben shlish l'pachos mishlish. Ha ha ha. Friends, you hear the question that Rabbi Yirmiyah asks Reb Zera. Rabbi Yirmiyah asks Reb Zera, he says, what do the rabbis know from grain? Ha ha. The rabbis are busy in the study hall. They're arguing about who knows what. What do they know about practical stuff? What do they know about? They're not farmers. They're academics. They live in the Beis HaMedrash. What do they know about grain reaching a third and determining when a grain has reached a third? Omalei, to which Reb Zera responds to Rabbi Yirmiyah, Lav amin alach, Rabbi Yirmiyah, haven't I told you a million times, lo tapik nafshech levar miyochasa, don't get involved in anything other than halacha. Keep your ideas to yourself. It's not good. It's not good when you start thinking about other things. Stick to halacha. Kol midos chachamim kein hu, because after all, yes, the rabbis do, in fact, know about when grain reaches a third, and they know about lots of different measurements and evaluations of things, because that's how all of their measurements are. For example, a mikveh needs to have 40 sa'ah of water. If it has any less than that, you cannot use it. You cannot go to the mikveh in that. And yes, they know the distinction between 40 sa'ah and slightly less than 40 sa'ah. Kibeya metame tumas ochlin. Kibeya chaser sumsum eno metame tumas ochlin. When it comes to contamination of foods, that if you have food that is tameh, it's able to be metame other foods if the food that is tameh is the size of an egg. And yes, they know how to determine between the size of an egg and if it's slightly less than the size of an egg. Shlosha al shlosha metame midros. Of course, we know that. Wait a second. Oh wow, so this isn't talking about shalosh etzbos, it's talking about shlosh tefachim, I believe. So something that's 3 tefachim by 3 tefachim is mitame midros, is able to contract tumas midros. Of course, if you have a friend who's a zov and he's an avatuma and he sits on a garment that's 3 tefachim by 3 tefachim, so then it becomes Tomei tumas midras. It is also an av atuma. Shlosha chaser nima achas enu metame midras. But if it is even a hair's breadth, slightly less than 3 tefachim by 3 tefachim, it will not contract tumas midras. So we see that yes, the rabbis actually are very detailed and exact when it comes to measurements, and that includes being able to evaluate once grain has reached a third of its growth. Hadar Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah. So then Rabbi Yirmiyah took back his sort of, I don't know how to describe it, but he took back his assertion that maybe the rabbis don't know what they're talking about. And he said, actually, no, the rabbis do know what they're talking about. Forget it, I take back what I said. Because the chevre, they asked of Kahana, Omer she'ekrivu Yisrael b'chnisasan la'aretz mehecha nikrivuhu. Ho 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 ho. Friends, when the Yidden entered into Eretz Yisrael with Yoshua, so it says that they entered into Eretz Yisrael on the 10th day of Nisan. Of course, that is 5 days before Pesach, and on the second day of Pesach, they offer the Korban HaOmer, right? The Omer offering, which then allows them to eat the grain of that year, the chodosh, the new grain from that year. So now, the chevra, they asked of Kahana, when the Yidden entered into Eretz Yisrael right before Pesach, so that first Korban Omer that they offered that year on the second day of Pesach, where did they get the barley from? They just got into Eretz Yisrael. Where did they get barley from? If you're going to say, well, they got barley from a local Gentile. A Gentile had a barley field, and they went therein and they asked if they could chaparine. So, but that won't work because the pasuk says that it has to be k'tzirchem. It has to be your harvested barley, and if it grew by the Gentile, if the Gentile grew the barley, it's not yours, it's his. Now, the Gemara says, wait a second, maybe they just didn't offer a Korban Omer that year. There wasn't enough time to grow barley, they didn't offer a Korban Omer that year. Lo sakadaitich, that's not an option. Because the pasuk says, Vayochlu me'avur ha'aretz mimachras ha'pesach. Because the pasuk says that from the second day of Pesach and onwards, they ate from the grain, the produce of the land, from the grain of the land. That the pasuk is specifically saying that they ate from the grain of the land from the second day of Pesach and onwards, not before then. Tekrivu omer v'hader achle. Mimele keilu, it means that on the second day of Pesach, when the omer was offered, that is what allowed them to then eat from the grain, from the chadash, from the grain of the land of that year. So we see that they certainly did offer the omer offering on the second day of Pesach, when they entered into Eretz Yisrael. So mehechan ikrivu. So back to our question: what barley did they use for the korban haomer? Omer lohen, to which Rav Kahana responded, Kol shelo hevi shlish biad nochri. Well, they were able to purchase grain that did not reach 1/3 of its growth. They purchased that from a Gentile, and then it grew over the following days into 1/3 of its growth. And at that point, or at least maybe all of its growth, whatever it is, but they definitely purchased barley that had not yet grown 1/3 of its growth. They purchased that from the Gentile, and therefore it was not considered as though it grew by the Gentile, it grew by the Yidden. And now, but wait, maybe it already was 1/3 of its growth, and they were unable to determine. What did the rabbis know, as Yirmiyah suggested? How did the rabbis know? Maybe they were not able to determine accurately whether this barley has actually reached 1/3 or not. Elo kimlu. Rather, it must be that they did know how to determine, and that's how they knew. They knew how to determine if barley had reached 1/3 or not. And based on their determination, the barley that they purchased had not yet reached 1/3 of its growth, and that's why they were able to purchase it for the korban haomer. And so we see that yes, the rabbis are able to determine between 1/3 and less than 1/3, which is how they were able to purchase barley for the omer offering when they got into Eretz Yisrael, the first year that they were there. Hochanami kimlu, and just like by the korban haomer, the first year in Eretz Yisrael, they were able to determine between 1/3 and less than 1/3. So here also, when it comes to determining for Meiser, also the rabbis are able to determine between 1/3, once grain has reached 1/3 or not. Vidilma lo ayil klal. But now the Gemara asks, wait, maybe when the Yidden went into Eretz Yisrael and they purchased barley for the korban omer, maybe it was barley that hadn't yet grown at all. But wait, one second. How do you know that the rabbis were able to determine between 1/3 and less than 1/3? Maybe the barley that they brought when they went into Eretz Yisrael, that they purchased when they came into Eretz Yisrael, maybe that was barley that hadn't grown at all. But if it would have grown a bit, they would not be able to tell the difference between a quarter or 1/3. What do they know? They could tell between nothing and something. So maybe they just bought barley that hadn't grown at all. But if it would have grown, they wouldn't necessarily be able to distinguish between 1/3, a quarter. Lo salkataytech. No, that's not an option. Because the pasuk says, "Va'am alu min hayarden be'esr lachodesh." Well, because the Yidden only came out from the Jordan River and entered into Eretz Yisrael on the 10th of Nisan. V'sakataytech to lo ayil klal. And if it enters your mind to say that this is barley that had not grown whatsoever, b'chamisha yomei mika malya, how could the barley then have, if they purchased barley from a Gentile that hadn't grown at all, even if they purchased it right away on the 10th day, how would it grow in 5 days so it'll be ready for the korban haomer on the second day of Pesach? How could grain go? How could this barley grow from nothing to ready to be offered for korban haomer in just 5 days? Elamai, the Ayel Riva Odanka. But the Gemara says, and so what? So what are you going to suggest? That they purchased barley that had already grown a quarter or maybe a sixth? Akati b'chamisha yomei mikamalya, still is 5 days going to be enough for barley that has only grown one quarter of its way, let's say, or 1/6 of its way, to grow into what is needed for the Korban Omer? Ella, Ma'islach Lememer, what do you have to say? Eretz Tzvik Sivba, Halchanami Eretz Tzvik Sivba. It says about Eretz Yisrael that it is the land of the deer, and deers run very fast, and therefore Eretz Yisrael is able to grow its produce very quickly. And therefore, so, we had initially said that the rabbis had purchased this barley that was not quite a third yet, and they were able to determine that it wasn't quite a third, which is why they were able to purchase it, and it was not considered as though it grew by the Gentile. However, then we suggested, wait, maybe it hadn't yet grown at all. To which we said, yeah, but if it hadn't yet grown at all, then how would it grown completely within 5 days from the time that they got out of the Jordan until the second day of Pesach? To which the Gemara says, yeah, but so what? So what are you suggesting? That they purchased this barley that was, let's say, a quarter of the way grown? Still, how can it grow in 5 days from a quarter of the way, and the whole way, so that you can use it for the Korban Omer? So rather, it must be that just we're relying, what happened was that Eretz Yisrael was able to produce this grain and grow this grain very quickly. And if that's the case, then we actually do not have a basis from the Korban Omer in the first year to say that the rabbis were able to distinguish between a third and less than a third, because the whole thing was a miracle anyways. The whole thing was because we're saying that Eretz Yisrael was able to produce this grain so quickly, in which case it could have actually been that the grain wasn't really grown at all, and they purchased grain that was like not yet growing, this barley that wasn't yet growing, and Eretz Yisrael, it just grew really, really fast and was ready for the Omer on the second day of Pesach. So yeah, we don't necessarily have a distinction from this thing with the Korban Omer in Eretz Yisrael to say that they were able to distinguish between a third and less than a third, because it could actually have been that the barley was actually not ready at all, just that Eretz Yisrael kicked in and grew it super fast. So that isn't necessarily a proof. But we do still, right, so it's not necessarily a proof that the rabbis, that's not going to prove for us that the rabbis are able to distinguish between a third and less than a third. However, at this point we are still relying upon the pasuk of Chag HaOsif, B'tzeis Hashanah, to teach us that grain that has reached, that is able to be harvested in Sukkot's time, has already reached a third of its growth from the previous year, and we're saying B'tzeis Hashanah that we treated from the previous year. From there we learn that grain that has grown 1/3 of its way will be treated for Meiser in the year in which it grew 1/3 of its way. Now, Maskifla Reb Chanina asks a question on this. Can you really say what you want to say? Can you really make the argument that when the pasuk says Chag HaOsif in the pasuk, it is referring to harvesting? That if you harvest, if there's grain that's ready to be harvested on Sukkot, it was already reached a third of its growth from the year before, and therefore it's treated from the year before. Can you say that that pasuk is really talking about, when it says gathering, it means harvesting? But we have another pasuk that says in the context of Sukkot, when you gather from your granary and from your wine press. And we said that the pasuk is talking about making schach. That for your sukkah, for schach, you use psolas gorin v'yekev, sort of like leftover branches and things from your granary and from your wine press, right? Things that grow from the ground and are not makabel tumah. So therefore, in our pasuk as well, when the pasuk says that is just teaching a halacha that by sukkah you have to use psolas gorin v'yekev for, right, something that's it's teaching you with what to use to make your schach. And therefore, what do we learn from Chag HaOsif? That Sukkot comes out at the time that you gather, and therefore, what Reb Chanina is saying, that actually Chag HaOsif is teaching us that it's the festival that comes out when you're at the time of year that you gather your grain after the summer. And when it says ba'aspuchas ma'asechem and asada, that's just talking about what you can use to make frischach. But Bechaga Asif is teaching that Sukkot falls out when you gather your grain, and therefore we don't have anywhere to say that it's talking about harvesting, and when you harvest on Sukkot, then it reached a third before Rosh Hashanah, and it's calling it B'tzeis Hashanah. No, that you can't learn that out. Chag Asif just means that Sukkot is the festival that falls out during the time that you gather. Well, if that's the case, well then what's going to be our proof to learn that grain is determined from Meiser based on when it reaches a third? So Amr Ibzera says, Ibzera Hamilsa Avoy Biyadon. We had this, we thought that we had our answer. We thought that we were good to go. That we had this pasuk of Chag Asif to teach us about grain that reaches a third. We thought we had what we needed. Vasu Chanina Shada Beinarga. And Reb Chanina came and destroyed that. Elaminalan, well then, how do we know that, that grain, once it reaches a third, is ready for Meiser? Kedetani Reb Yonasan ben Yosef Omer. As we learn in the Brisa, it says Reb Yonasan ben Yosef, but also says that when it comes to Shemitah, so Shemitah, you're not going to be able to work your field in the 7th year, so you're going to kind of run out of food. You're not going to be able to plant again until the 8th year, and then you got to wait for it to grow. And you're really not going to be taking into your house that grain until Sukkot of the 9th year. So therefore, the yield of the 6th year really needs to produce food for the 6th year, for the 7th year, for the 8th year. You're really not going to be in full swing again until the 9th year. So the pasuk says, don't worry. The Eibishter is going to send a blessing on the 6th year, and it'll provide enough food. Enough food will grow for 3 years. Atikre the shlosh, elu the shlish. And then we make a drasha. Don't read it for 3, rather read it as a third, to teach us that once grain reaches a third of its growth, that is when it's going to be chayiv in Meiser v'ami b'ilei legufe. To which the pasuk says wait. To which the Gemara says wait. This pasuk of the also says atvur l'shlosh hashanim, that the Eibishter is going to send a blessing, and the 6th year will provide enough food for 3 years. Well, that's needed us to teach us precisely that the Eibishter is going to provide on the 6th year enough food for 3 years. Not to make a drasha of that grain that reaches a third is now chayiv in Meiser. So the Gemara says, Ksiv kra'achrina. No, we don't need this pasuk to teach us about the 3 years, because we have another pasuk that says, Uzraitim es Hashanah Shminis, that you're going to work your fields now in the 8th year after Shemitah. Va'achaltem, and what are you going to be eating up until now? Min hatvua yashan, from the old grain that you still have from the 6th year, ad Hashanah Tshiyas, until the 9th year. So we see that we have another pasuk that teaches us that the Eibishter is going to provide enough food on the 6th year to last you until the 9th year. And therefore this pasuk says, the first pasuk which says, it's talking about the shlish, i.e. to learn that grain, once it reaches a third, it's now chayiv in Meiser, and the year in which it reaches a third is going to be the year in which you separate Meiser. The chiyuv of Meiser will be considered as part of that year. Tanan awesome. We learn over there in the Mishnah, Oriz v'adochan, rice and millet, v'aprogin, poppy. Everybody in Eretz Yisrael knows that pereg is poppy seeds. How does everybody in Eretz Yisrael know that pereg is poppy seeds? The same way. Everybody knows it the same way. The first time, it's old, it's not even a chiddush. The first time you buy a chocolate babka, and it turns out to be a poppy seed babka, and you look at the package and it says pereg, that's how you know that pereg means poppy seeds. You learn it the hard way. It's not awesome. So I'm pretty sure that 90% of Americans know that pereg is poppy from that particular experience. Tanan also we learn in the Mishnah, ha'oriz v'adochen, so rice, millet, progin, and poppy, v'asumsmin, and sesame seeds, she'eshrishu l'fnei Rosh Hashanah, that took root. Friends, listen carefully. Took root before Rosh Hashanah. So now these are all legumes, and we're saying that legumes are based on when they take root. Misasim the sha'avar, so they're going to be considered, the year of Meiser is going to be from the previous year, i.e. the year before Rosh Hashanah, Umutarim Bashvias, and if it's the 6th year and going into the 7th year, and they took root before Rosh Hashanah, so you're going to be allowed to, there's no issues of Shemitah over there because they're considered to have grown in the previous year. V'im lav asurim b'shvius, but if they did not yet take root before Rosh Hashanah, they only take root right after Rosh Hashanah on Shemitah, well then you're not going to be able to eat them because they're considered like you grew them on Shemitah. U'misasrin l'shana haba'a, and the Meiser year would be the Shemitah year, but obviously in Shemitah we don't separate Trumas and Meiser, so if it was any other year of the Shemitah cycle, so then if it takes root after Rosh Hashanah, so then the Meiser year would be based on the year in which it took root in, whatever year is after Rosh Hashanah. Amar Rabba, says Rabba, Amar Rabbanon, Elon Basachanato. Rabba says, one second, okay. So we have a few different existing distinctions here when it comes to Truma and Meiser. That when it comes to a tree, so it's Basachanato. Trees are chayev in Meiser from the time that they start producing fruit. So once they start producing fruit, so at that point they're chayev in Meiser. Tvua v'zeisim basar shlish, and grain and grapes and olives are chayev in Meiser once they reach a third of their growth. Yerek basar l'kita, vegetables, as we learned the other day, goes based on when they are chaptarain, based on when they're gathered, harvested. Hani keman shavinu rabbanon. Now when it comes to legumes, we're finding another distinction, which is when they take root. So what's that based on? It's not like the trees, it's not like the grains, and it's not like the vegetables. So the Omer Rabba then said, Mitoch she'asuyin prochin. Well, since these legumes are ready at different times, right? They're not all just ready to be chaptarain at the same time. The legumes, I guess, you pick them at all sorts, whenever they're ready, you pick them, but they're not all ready at the same time. And therefore, you're going to have some that you're picking right before Rosh Hashanah, some that you're picking after Rosh Hashanah, because also remember, I believe that we've learned together that the only things that are chayiv and meiser midah oraisa is grain and grapes and olives. Everything else is chayiv and trumas and meiser midah rabbanon. So these legumes are only chayiv and meiser midah rabbanon. So therefore, the rabbis say that they're chayiv and meiser, and they are also determining how to determine at which point it's chayiv and meiser. And therefore they're saying, well, when it comes to these legumes, they're picked at all different times. And therefore, if it's based on the time that you harvest these legumes, you're going to have some legumes that are harvested before Rosh Hashanah, some that are harvested after Rosh Hashanah, and it's going to be a big mess. And you're going to have to keep track of what's what, so that you make sure to harvest the ones from before Rosh Hashanah with the ones from before Rosh Hashanah, the ones after Rosh Hashanah with the ones after Rosh Hashanah. So they say, look, forget about when you harvest them. It'll be based on when they take root. Because they're all going to take, if they're all planted at the same time, they're all going to take root at the same time. So, says Rabba, mitoch shasuyim prochin, since you're going to basically harvest them at different times, as the Rabbanon basar ashrasha, the rabbis say that it goes based on when it takes root, because if you plant them all at the same time, they're all going to take root at least at the same time, and therefore whatever year that is, so then that is going to be considered when we consider it for meiser, and then you can separate meiser from all of these legumes together, regardless of when each particular legume was harvested. Abaye suggests, wait, Rabba, you're saying, Rabba, that the reason why, when it comes to legumes, that we consider it for meiser based on when it takes root, is because, well, if you do it based on when it's harvested, well then, since you're harvesting them all at different times, it'll become a big mess. Says Abaye, it won't become a big mess. Because v'yitzborganu l'socho, why can't we say that the legumes go based on when they're harvested? And even though they're harvested at different times, and some may have been harvested before Rosh Hashanah, and some may have been harvested after Rosh Hashanah, v'yitzborganu l'socho, take all of the granary, all of the legumes, regardless of when each particular legume was harvested, mix them all up in one big mixture. And then you're going to be separating from the Chodesh on the Chodesh and the Yashan on the Yashan. Meaning, if you have all of these legumes, some were harvested before Rosh Hashanah, some after Rosh Hashanah, but then you mix them all up in a big mixture. So the probability is, I think you have to have a certain, I think technically speaking, mathematically speaking, you have to have like a certain minimum amount for this to be true. But assuming, let's say, that you have a lot of these legumes and you mix them up really well, well then statistically, if you, let's say you have, I don't know, a ton of legumes, and then you separate 10% of a ton for Meiser, statistically speaking, whatever percentage of that mixture was harvested before Rosh Hashanah will be represented in this 10% of a ton, and whatever percentage was harvested after Rosh Hashanah will be represented in this 10% of a ton, right? Meaning, let's say 30% of it was harvested before Rosh Hashanah and 70% of it was harvested after Rosh Hashanah. Well, when you take your 10% of Meiser, well, meaning 4 Meiser, statistically speaking, 30% of that is going to be from the legumes that you harvested before Rosh Hashanah, and 70% is going to be from the legumes that you harvested after Rosh Hashanah. So, Kilu, who cares? So says Abaye, it shouldn't really matter what's harvested, right? The fact that these legumes are ripe at different times and you harvest some before Rosh Hashanah and some after Rosh Hashanah. It shouldn't matter. Take them all, mix them all together, create one big mixture, and then separate Meiser from the big mixture. And statistically speaking, you will have in your Meiser the amount that you're supposed to have from the previous year and the amount that you're supposed to have from the current year. So again, Abaye says to Rabba, why don't you just harvest them whenever you harvest them? And it goes based on when you harvest them, but then just take the big mixture and mix it all together, and then take your Meiser, and statistically speaking, v'nimtza, it'll turn out, that you will have taken Meiser for the new stuff, right, from the new stuff, and you would have taken Meiser from the old stuff, right, statistically speaking, in this Meiser that you separate. Milotanya, after all, do we not have the following brisa? Rabbi Yossi ben Kippur Omar says, Rabbi Yossi ben Kippur Mishum Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, in the name of Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, Pul Amitzri, Egyptian beans. Sounds tasty. Shazura'o Lizera, that you planted it for seeds, because when it comes to these Egyptian beans, there's 2 ways that you could plant it. Either as seeds, I guess like sunflower seeds. Sunflower seeds might be one of my least favorite parts of living in Eretz Yisrael. The people eat the sunflower seeds. I guess that's a different sugya. So wow, did I just say that? I guess so. Well, sorry. No. Yeah. Well, I just said it. So, Shazor Lizera. So, where are we? So these Egyptian beans. So you can either plant them as seeds, for seeds, or you could plant them as a vegetable. And if you plant it to be a vegetable, so then it's going to be based on when you harvest it. If you plant it as a seed, so it'll be treated as a legume. So Shazro Lizera, if you have these Egyptian beans that you planted to be as seeds, so therefore we're treating it as legumes, and Meiser is going to be based on when it takes root, Hashrasha. So Miktsaso Ishish Lefnei Rosh Hashanah, part of it took root before Rosh Hashanah, Miktsaso Ishish Lachar Rosh Hashanah, and part of it took root after Rosh Hashanah. In Tormin Ma'asu Mizel Zeh, so you're not allowed to just kind of take Meiser casually from one year, right, from this batch that was harvested after, that took root after Rosh Hashanah, and the batch that took root before Rosh Hashanah. Because as we've seen, you're not allowed to take Meiser from the old stuff for the new stuff, and not from the new stuff for the old stuff. You have to, the Meiser, you have to keep everything clean, right? Keep the old stuff together, the new stuff together, and separate Meiser from the new stuff and the Meiser from the old stuff. Keep everything separate. So what does he do? What you can do is sover gorno l'socho. You can just mix them all up together really well. But says Reb Shimon Shazuri, what you can do is, you can take all of these Pula Mitzris, mix them all up together real good, the old stuff, the new stuff, and then when you separate Meiser, statistically, you are going to be separating, the old stuff that you're supposed to be separating, the new stuff that you're supposed to be separating. It'll all be properly represented in the Meiser that you take from the big mixture. Omar Le, to which Rabbah responds to Abaye. Remember, Rabbah had said that the whole reason why we say that by legumes the Meiser is determined by when it takes root, as opposed to when it's harvested, is because it's harvested at different times when it will become a mess. Abaye said, so let it become a mess. Who cares? Mix it all together then. Separate Meiser from the mixture, and Memele, the Meiser will be properly, right, everything, the old stuff, the new stuff, everything will be properly represented in the Meiser that you take. And he brings a proof from Reb Shimon Shazuri, to which Rabbah responds, Omerle, Rabbah responds to Abaye, Reb Shimon Shazuri ka'amar. Abaye, do you hear what you're saying? You're suggesting that, well, Reb Shimon Shazuri says you can mix them all together and then separate Meiser. Reb Shimon Shazuri savar yesh bila, Rabbanan savar ein bila. Reb Shimon Shazuri holds that there's mixing together, that there's what's called bila. Bila means mixing together. Reb Shimon Shazuri holds that you're allowed to take these things, mix them all together, and that'll count as a mixture, and then the Meiser will be properly representative. But the rabbis argue and say that there isn't bila, that you're not able to mix all of these things together and then consider it to be that the Meiser that you separate is properly representative. You cannot do that according to the rabbis, and therefore Rabbah says, look, the rabbis would say that you would not be allowed to make this mixture, and therefore I'm saying like the rabbis, that you cannot just make this mixture, and therefore the rabbis, when determining Meiser for legumes, they said, look, legumes are all harvested at different times, but if you plant them all at the same time, they'll take root at the same time. So therefore, when we are enacting Meiser for legumes, we'll say that it's based on taking root, so that you know how to determine Meiser, and then you can separate Meiser from all of these legumes at the same time without having to worry about what's new and what's old. Friends, that was Daf Yud Gimel on Masechta Rosh Hashanah. So, a lot of today's daf was focused on determining that when it comes to Dagon, Tirosh, and Yitzhar, grain and grapes and olives, that it's Truma, that its Meiser is determined based on once it reaches a third. We had a few psukim to teach us that. First, we wanted to learn it out from the fact that by Hakel, it mentions Shemitah. We're saying, what does Shemitah have to do with anything? Well, we're saying that if you have grain that reaches a third of its growth during Shemitah, it'll continue on to the next year as well, which we then asked, wait, but maybe it's teaching just that Shemitah continues until Sukkot of the next year, to which we said, no, that can't be. We then brought a different pasuk by Chag HaOsif, which we wanted to say, it says, Chag HaOsif b'tzeis Hashanah. We wanted to say Chag HaOsif is actually referring to harvesting, that if you harvest something during Sukkot, the rabbis have determined that it Memela reached a third of its growth the year before, and we're saying that it's considered B'tzeis Hashanah from the previous year, so we see that the year in which it reaches a third of its growth is the year that determines its Meiser status, to which we then said that actually Chag HaOsif is not referring to harvesting there, it actually is referring to gathering, and therefore we can't learn out anything about a third. So then we bring a different pasuk that when it comes to Shemitah, it says that the Eibishter will provide enough food on the 6th year for 3 years, and we say that 3 is actually referring to a third, from which we learn out of drasha that grain, once it has reached a third, is already now chayiv in Meiser, and that's what determines the year in which it's going to be treated for Meiser. And then we brought up an additional halacha, which is that when it comes to legumes, legumes are determined for Meiser based on when they take root. Then we saw an interesting machlokas between Abaye and Rabbah, that Rabbah says that how come when it comes to legumes it's based on when they take root? After all, we don't see that measure, we don't see that by any of the other things. We don't see it by trees, we don't see it by grains, we don't see it by vegetables. So Rabbah said, well, because legumes are harvested at all sorts of different times to make things easier, the rabbis, when they decided that you have to take Meiser from legumes, they said do it based on when it takes root. Abaye then says, wait, but what about this concept of bila? That there's a concept that when everything is mixed together very well in a mixture, well then you can assume that whatever Meiser you're taking is representative of the mixture. So let the rabbis determine Meiser based on when you harvest it. And then even though you're harvesting at different times, some may have been before Rosh Hashanah, some after Rosh Hashanah, mix them all together. You have a big mixture. Separate Meiser from the big mixture. And then, statistically, whatever percentage was meant to be from the previous year will be represented in this Meiser from the previous year. And whatever is from the new year will be represented in this Meiser from the new year. To which Rabbi points out that yes, but the concept of Bila is actually machlokas. While Reb Shimon Shazuri says that we do say Bila, that you can have these mixtures and treat it as a mixture, and that anything that you separate from the mixture will be representative of the mixture. The rabbis argue and say that we do not say Bila. We do not say that you can just consider this mixture to be mixed up really well, and whatever that you separate from it will be representative of the mixture. We do not say that according to the rabbis, therefore you cannot, that's Rabbi's argument for why we would not say Bila, and why we have to say that Meiser of legumes is based on when they take root as opposed to when they are harvested. Friends, that was Daf Yud Gimel, Daf 13, the page of love, the page of oneness. Friends, have a onenessy, lovey day. Peace.